Hi guys, welcome back to Living the Gandy Life. Today I want to share with you guys how we have been studying history and give you a little bit of a glimpse into some of the outputs, some of the things that we generate from our studies. I know I've mentioned before in my curriculum videos that we do not do or use a formal history curriculum. We do, however, use an old version, the 4th edition of the Foundations Guide for Classical Conversations. And we really use this as our jumping board for what we're going to be studying. So we are in cycle 3, so we are using and studying the American history. And what it does is it breaks it down into information that we're going to cover each week. And one of those pieces is history. And so each week we have a history sentence that we study for that week. And it goes from Columbus in 1492 up to, I believe, 9/11, with a couple other things like the presidents and the Bill of Rights and some government things like that. So basically we just use whatever sentence is for that week and kind of use that as our jumping board for what we're going to dive into on our own as a family. So for example, I mentioned that the very first week we are covering Columbus in 1492. So when we studied Columbus and we memorized this history sentence, we just used some books that we had gathered and we read those as a family. So we read the Delaire Columbus book. And I think I've showed it before. It is a longer picture book, so it wasn't something that we sat down and read in one sitting. I think we read it over the course of a week. Again, we do our history in a loop schedule, so we're not covering history every day. We're kind of looping it around with science and one day of poetry and art. So we're not covering it every day, but over the course of the week, we read a couple of books. We read Columbus, and then we also read Pedro's journal. So it's kind of from the standpoint of a ship's boy and kind of him keeping a journal while he's on the ship with Christopher Columbus. So these were the two books that we read during the week while we were studying Columbus. Now, what was the output from what my kids were doing from their standpoint? So I have a notebook for each of my kids. Gabriel has one. Now, again, because we do a loop schedule with history and science, you'll see that they have a history and science notebook. I knew that we weren't going to fill out an entire one for history, an entire notebook for science, so it's kind of intermixed between the two, but each kid has their own color, they have their own notebook for history and science. And you're going to notice too, as I show you some examples, that what my kids do, it really depends on their level. You're going to notice I am homeschooling 4 kids. I only have 3 notebooks because my youngest is in preschool. So if she's happy to sit and just listen to the story, I am perfectly okay with that being all that she does. And if I'm honest, sometimes she's not even in the room, and I'm okay with that too, because sometimes she can just be a distraction for the boys. So, but you will notice that with Gabriel, my oldest, there is a difference between him and what my youngest is doing. So let me just show you what that looks like after we read these books. Now, not every time did I have them pull out their notebook. I don't want reading or history to just be another chore, so to speak. So sometimes we read and sometimes it just lends itself to discussion. Other times we read and we do kind of pull out maybe something that really stuck out to them personally, or something that we learned that we read that day. So, for example, when we read about Christopher Columbus, this was my oldest drawing, and he drew the 3 ships. So we have the Santa Maria, which he wrote was the biggest. And then he drew the Pinta, which he wrote was the fastest. And then he wrote the Nina, which was the smallest. And those were facts that we learned through reading that book. Then he also just wrote at the bottom that Christopher Columbus was from Italy. He was on a boat and it was sunk by pirates, and Columbus got on an oar and floated to Portugal. And because Portugal was at war, they didn't have money to send him on a boat, so he went to Spain and they sent him on the boats. So Columbus, he also wrote that Columbus was on the Santa Maria. So those were just some facts that he pulled out. Now, if I show you the difference, so my 3rd grader, he also drew the ships. And he also wrote that the Pinta was the fastest, the Nina was the smallest, and the Santa Maria, that Columbus sailed on the Santa Maria. So his drawings are a little bit crazier, but as long as they are getting something from it, I'm not correcting their spelling. A lot of times, if they ask me, of course, I'm going to tell them how to spell something. But a lot of times I just encourage them to, spell it the way that they think it would be spelled. And I just let it go because I'm just wanting them to be able to recall some of the facts on their own and be able to just put it down on paper. So if it's not perfect, I'm not really looking for that. I'm just wanting to make sure that they can get something from the book. My youngest drew a ship as well, and you'll see, I can even give you some examples. A lot of times I am giving him sticky notes that we're talking about what we read, and then I'll put one, maybe two sentences on a sticky note, and then he copies that down into here because he's not quite at the stage in which he can put those thoughts down into complete sentences on his own. And honestly, I think he would get really discouraged trying to spell. He's kind of a perfectionist, so he doesn't like trying to spell things if he doesn't know how to spell them and then be correct. So we're still working with his sticky notes for right now for my youngest, but he is still doing his drawings on his own. So that's kind of showing you the range in between all of my kids and what the expectation is and how it's different between all the kids. So that was week 1. Now, week 2, we were talking about the Pilgrims. So we read a couple of books about the Pilgrims. We read the Thanksgiving story, and then we also read the first Thanksgiving. I think we had another book in there as well, but those were some shorter books. We didn't have a picture book this time. Let me see here. Okay, so my youngest drew a boat and said that the Pilgrims would catch fish on the boat, so that they would that would be what they would eat. So let's see what else we have here. To skip through some of the science that they have. My middle son wrote that Squanto told the Pilgrims how to plant a seed and put a fish underneath the seed to help the corn grow. And that was something that really stuck out to him. So here he drew how the seed was below the plant and it helped the corn to grow. And that was what stuck out to him, which is totally fine. I wanted them to gather something on their own. And then my oldest said the Pilgrims had the first Thanksgiving and invited Massasoit, and he brought 90 other Indians, and they celebrated for 3 days. So he drew the feast at the table between everyone. So again, they all varied. They all kind of picked different things out this time because it was what really stuck out to them. But those were what they gathered from their history sins. So we're doing it in conjunction with what we're doing out of our CC guide, but we're picking our own books that we already own or books that we're getting from the library. Now that moves us on to what we did for week 3, and that was about the Boston Tea Party. So for the Boston Tea Party, we read And Then What Happened, Paul Revere, and You Wouldn't Want to Be at the Boston Tea Party. We also watched an episode of Liberty's Kids that coincided with the Boston Tea Party. So if you have never checked out Liberty's Kids and you've got young kiddos, it's a really cool cartoon that is kind of showing history. So I would suggest that as well. But with that, again, they all picked out something. My oldest actually drew them dressed up as Mohawks and dumping the tea overboard. They sometimes take some artistic liberties with their drawings, as well as people being thrown over, or typical boy stuff, which usually covers bathroom humor. So I apologize if any of these cover that. But he said in 1773, colonists dressed as Mohawks dumped tea from the British East India Company into Boston Harbor. So that was what he took. And that's actually our history sentence from our guide. So he just kind of wrote that down. My middle son did that as well. He drew them dumping the tea, obviously dressed as Mohawks. So that was what he covered as well. And that was what my youngest did as well. But you can see it's all obviously based on their skill level. It is different based on their age. So that was week 3. And then week 4 and 5 covered the Declaration of Independence and George Washington. And honestly, during those times, we were traveling. And so we weren't formally covering anything during this time, but I wanted to share something that we did instead. So we traveled out west, and we were in Colorado. And one of the places that we were traveling while we drove out there is we stopped at Daniel Boone's home. So we grabbed a book at the gift shop about Daniel Boone. And while we were driving on flat, straight Kansas, I was reading this book to them. Now, it is not recorded in anywhere in our notebooks. We didn't have it with us, but we were covering history by reading this book that we picked up at the gift shop. And we had a lot of discussions about it and a lot of things that were funny that they remember. If I were to ask them now, they would still remember. So this is how we were covering history, even though it wasn't part of our formal, like it didn't necessarily fall into what our guide said, but we kind of pressed pause and we were doing things that coincided with what we were seeing in person. So that was something that we covered while we were gone. Another thing on our way back through, we went up into Wyoming and through Nebraska, and we were kind of covering the area of the Oregon Trail. We went to Fort Laramie and then also Scotts Bluff and Chimney Rock, which were all places and points along the Oregon Trail. So actually, while we were at the St. Louis Arch, we grabbed this book out of the gift shop. They had an amazing gift shop with tons of really great books. My husband had to pull me away from it, but we grabbed this one while we were there, and it became so awesome because as we were reading it, we were finding all of these great nuggets of, it was mentioning Fort Laramie, it was mentioning Chimney Rock, it was mentioning the ruts. We stopped in Guernsey, Wyoming, where they actually had the Oregon Trail ruts from where the covered wagons had gone, and you could walk through these old ruts that had been made by the wagons. And so we walked through those, and so it talked about them in the book. And we went to the cliff register where a lot of the people who were traveling through it was sandstone, so they would carve their names of the family and the year that they were traveling through into the rock. And they kind of talked about how people would sometimes write notes or leave things in the rocks or in the trees or on old skeletons of animals that had died for maybe families that were passing through later to see. So it was so neat of how when we're reading these books, that it was tying into things that we're actually seeing firsthand. And I honestly believe that it was just making history come alive. I was loving this personally. I think my kids were, but I was loving it. So it really didn't matter if they were, because I was having such a good time being like, oh man, we just saw this, it's in this book. And it was just a great opportunity to pull in some history with the things that we were actually experiencing. But once we got back, we did kind of jump in. We tried to do some catch up with some of the things that we had missed while we were gone. So a couple of those things, like I mentioned, were the Declaration of Independence and George Washington becoming the first president. So when we did that, we had a couple of books that we read along with that. We read another Dallaire book, which was about George Washington. And again, we read this, I think it might have been over the course of maybe 1 or 2 days. It is a picture book, but it's a little bit longer. So a lot of times if you've got some wiggly kids, they may not be able to sit through the whole thing, but we read that one. We also read George Washington's Breakfast, which was a fun one. And then we also read The Matchlock Gun. And this was more just about being in the same time period. It says on the back that it was in 1756. So just that general time period, but we read this short little chapter book together as well. Now, this was one of those instances when we read all 3 of these books, we actually didn't do anything of putting them into our notebooks. I just scanned through, wondering if actually we'd ever sat down and actually put anything into them, and we didn't. And that's okay, because I do remember conversations that we had about the book. And a lot of times, as I mentioned before, I just don't want them to feel like it's just another thing. I want them to understand that history is important, and it can be fun, and it can be just something that we read for enjoyment, and it can just lend itself to discussion, not just always having to sit down and take notes or to write something. So I think finding a good balance of finding things for enjoyment as well as finding some things to make sure we are getting something from the material is always a good idea. To bring us to our most recent week, we had a history sentence that talked about the Louisiana Purchase and Lewis and Clark. And so that led us to the book we read this landmark book about Lewis and Clark. I really enjoyed this book. I thought it was a great way of tying conversation and history in, and just some really interesting facts that really kept the kids interested in the book. So we really enjoyed this one. It did take us a little, pretty much like a week to read it. I mean, I will say, even though it's a chapter book, it is bigger font, and it's not, it has nice spacing, but it also had some pictures in it that the kids enjoyed seeing. So not a ton of pictures, but a few that every once in a while they were at least intrigued to be able to see the pictures. So because we did cover this over a longer period, we did have a few more times where we actually wrote in our notebook a little bit more. And I'll show you some of those examples. So in the beginning, when they were talking about Lewis and Clark, they were talking about how they were experiencing and seeing new animals as they trekked across the new territory, that they were seeing animals that they had never seen before, and that they had to shoot grizzly bears. I actually said it would take like 2 men and several shots to be able to get these grizzly bears down. So here's my oldest son's picture and rendering of shooting the grizzly bears and some of the other animals that they had seen. Here's my middle son talking about how they had to kill a bear as well, so that it took 2 men to kill the bear. And then my youngest, let's see. Oh, and here's the thing too. Sometimes they don't even get it the right side up, but it is what it is. These boys aren't going to get everything, but it said Lewis and Clark shot a grizzly bear. So, the drawings are awfully, I love this one. It's like, rawr. All right. So, the picture is super cute, but they were shooting the grizzly bear. So, they each kind of came up with their point and took it home. Let's see. We read it, and I think we talked about it another time. Here's another one that they talked about, that they had an Indian guide with them for a while on top of Sacagawea, but they called him, Clark couldn't pronounce his name, so he called him Old Toby. And so Old Toby was the guide, and that everybody was really hungry and thin because they were walking through the winter and they were having trouble finding food, and that one of their horses actually fell off the cliff, and it was a really bad loss because the horse was actually carrying a lot of their winter clothes and even some of the flour and the food that they were hoping to be able to eat. So he drew the horse falling off the cliff. Same with my middle son. A lot of times they are, kind of looking at their older brother and using his ideas for what they're going to draw. And let's see. Yep, here's my youngest about Old Toby leading. They were on a cliff ledge, and that Old Toby led Lewis and Clark through the Rocky Mountains on the cliffs. So that was another one, and we were still reading it, and we talked about how they made it all the way out to the Pacific coast. So they were trying to see the Pacific Ocean, and they made it out, and they made they built Fort Clatsop out there, and had raised the American flag. And it was the first one to be raised. They didn't see anything else in the Louisiana Territory. So this is my son. He built the fort, and he's drawing the flag right here because that was what Lewis and Clark had done. So you can kind of see, like, they're just really pulling from the things that we're reading here. Same thing. They built the fort. They have the flag, the waves and the ocean on the side. We're not using a textbook. We're not doing multiple choice questions. I'm really trying to get them involved and enjoying the literature that we're reading and the stories here. They're building the fort. You can see they definitely take some artistic liberties with the drawings. And then our last one, again, another upside down drawing in the notebook. But we talked about how when they trekked back, they actually did run into the Blackfeet Indians and had kind of an altercation with them, and some of the Indians died, and they had to basically race off and make it to the Missouri River to try to escape from the Blackfeet Indians. So that was just another part of the story that we read today. So you can see we're not doing multiple choice questions. I do ask them questions periodically as I'm reading, but I'm not quizzing them or making questions and having them answer them. We're doing more discussion with them. So now that I've given you a little glimpse of some of the things that we have covered in our history curriculum, if you will, I want to just kind of share with you some of the pros and cons that I have found with doing your history with this method. I'll start with the pros. So one of the first pros that I have is that you can follow your own schedule and you can really be flexible. If you really want to spend more time covering a certain area or reading more books, you have the flexibility to do so. So if you're really interested in something, go for it. Don't spend 1 week on it like here. Let it last a little bit longer. Get more books. Read more things about it. Don't just let it stop with maybe the one chapter in a textbook if you were using a textbook, but you would actually be able to cover a lot more information and go in a lot more depth by having this flexibility to really study the things that you want to study. The second thing is you have the flexibility to change your schedule or what you're going to study when an interest arises, or maybe, and I like in our case, when you're traveling. So when we were traveling, we kind of pushed pause and we studied about Daniel Boone, and then we really studied about the Oregon Trail. So when you are kind of in charge of what you're studying, you can grab books and read them and kind of follow what interest or where you are and let that be your guide. And I love that aspect because anytime you can study something and see it firsthand is really going to help commit those things to memory, and it's going to make a lot more sense and really just bring it to life. Another pro is that living books tend to be a little bit more interesting than your textbook. Your textbook is really going to be focusing on the names, places, and the events, whereas living books are showing a lot of dialogue and adding maybe sometimes more like a historical fiction, where we're going to throw some things in that were probably true to the time with a lot of fact. Sometimes I just think a living book is going to bring the history to life a little bit more than maybe a textbook would. I also think that when you're reading these books, it does lend themselves to having good discussions about social topics, things that are right and things that are wrong as you're reading them with your kids. So we've had a lot of discussion over things such as taxation without representation when we were discussing the Boston Tea Party. We have talked about slavery. We have also talked about the effects of the effects of westward expansion on the Indian tribes. We've also had a lot of discussions about what it would have taken to travel the Oregon Trail and all the hard work and all of the difficulties that they would have had while traveling and all the things that they would have faced. We're constantly reminding like how blessed we are that, we're not walking alongside a covered wagon. When we traveled out and we were basically traveling the path of the Oregon Trail, we kept reminding the kids that that during that time, they would have been traveling like 10 miles a day. And the kids probably would have been walking the majority of the time because, let's be honest, the wagons were not smooth rides and comfortable. They would have been extremely bumpy and very uncomfortable. And so unless they needed a short break for their legs, the majority of that time would have been walking. And another pro is that, honestly, this is a really cheap way to cover history. The only thing that I really, truly had to purchase were these notebooks, which were less than $1. So, I did buy some of these books, but let's be honest, I love books. So I was going to buy them anyway. But I didn't have to buy a history curriculum, and all of these books I could have gotten from the library and just had them prepped and ready to go with a little bit of planning. So I didn't have to buy them, but I chose to buy them because I love books. Now, let's move to the cons, because there are a couple of cons. The first being is that you do have to plan and you do have to do some digging and find these books that you're going to coincide with whatever you plan to cover for that week in your history. So I did have to do some digging and know, okay, well, we're going to be studying Christopher Columbus for week 1. So what are some books that I want to read that correspond to Christopher Columbus? Now, I didn't have to necessarily do all of the legwork. There are lots of book lists out there that exist that will tell you if you're studying XYZ. Here are some books that might help you if you're going to study them. So I did refer to these book lists that already exist, but I kind of had to pare down because otherwise I could have been reading 50 books a week, because let's be honest, there are tons of kids' books. So you do kind of have to pick and choose, and you do have to schedule out which books you would like to. If you watched any of my planning videos, you know that I had this really lofty goal of lots of these books. And I'll be honest with you, I have not read all of them. I'm kind of marking which ones I have, and then on break weeks or weeks that we're not covering new material, I do intend to maybe go back and pick and choose some of the ones that we haven't covered. So that's an option as well if you're not trying to stick to it. Or if you're trying to stick to a schedule, you can always go back and read other books when time allows, or you can have the flexibility to stretch out that time period, cover more books before you move on to the next topic. But as a con, yes, you are going to have to sift through, plan your books out, and then find those books and have them ready for the week that you're covering that particular topic. Now, another con is if you're wanting to have visible results of what your kids are or are not learning, like a multiple choice test, this is not necessarily going to be the method for you, because in the end, yes, my kids are drawing and we're having these discussions about things, but I'm not quizzing them or testing them on what they retain after a section or a period. We do have periodic conversations where I'm constantly saying, hey, why don't you tell your dad what we read about or what we learned that was really cool about Lewis and Clark today? So those are ways to throw in little opportunities to make sure that they're, storing some things in their mind. But in the end, if you're wanting visible results or something to show like, okay, we know it, we don't know it, this may not be something that's going to make you feel super comfortable. So you could always use the extra living books to throw in to accompany maybe a curriculum. But if you're wanting those visible results, this probably won't be what you would want to choose. And another con that I thought of is that this method is very heavily parent involved. I am doing all of the reading in here. So all these books that I held up, all these ones that we've covered so far, I have read. And so that requires me to be there. That requires me to be involved with what they're writing, looking over, making sure that they're doing something. And, in the case of my youngest, making sure that he has a sticky note or some facts to write down. So I can't just turn him loose, say, hey, read this, do the multiple choice test, and then check in, a half hour later. I'm actually there. I'm actually involved. And it does take time to read all of these books. So with all of that said, I'll just end with saying that anytime you can study something that is an interest to your child or that they find interesting, you're going to find that those things are going to stick with them and they're going to hold their attention a lot better. You're also going to find that the degree to which they retain all that information is going to drastically increase. When our kids are invested in a topic and they're really, really drawn to it, you're going to find that they're going to put a lot more into knowing all of those things. An example that I have is my son loves birds, or maybe a little bit more past tense. He still likes them, but we went through almost a year where he just delved into everything bird, books and all of these different activities that involved involved birds. And the kid could literally pick out and point out almost every species of bird. And so because he was interested and because he was choosing to pick up those books and he was enjoying them, he retained the information so much better. And so I will say the same with this. Anytime that we can study something that our kids are interested in, they're going to retain it. So if they're interested in the Civil War or World War II or the Lewis and Clark expedition or the Oregon Trail, dive into it. Take an opportunity if it's something that they love and, go after it full force, because when they're interested, when they're into it, they're going to retain the information so much better. And it's an awesome experience to learn with them and to watch them just absorb all of that information. In the end, just do whatever you can to make history fun. If you walk into it and you're really enthused about it and you're just having a grand old time with it, that's probably going to bleed over to them. The opposite is true. If you find it super boring or you're not enjoying it, that is probably going to bleed over with them as well. So just, even if you have to fake it, try to act like you're excited about history, and maybe that excitement will bleed over onto them as well. Honestly, I had this conversation with my kids just the other day talking about how important history is. And I brought up this quote from George Santayana. I think Winston Churchill also kind of re-quoted him at some point. But his quote was, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." We just really had this conversation about how it's important to know history, to make sure that we don't repeat it, we don't make those same mistakes. So if you can come with that attitude of why it's so important to know history, maybe that will help you have an attitude of why you really want to get excited about history, and that excitement will bleed over with your kids as well. All right, guys, that's all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed seeing how we've been covering our history. If you have any questions, as always, I would love to answer them for you. Until next time, have a very blessed day.